strange. That's you. I haven't touched you in months.
When she smiled and said, "You'll be a father again," the room seemed to tilt, as if reality itself had slipped out of place. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply looked at her, eyes steady, voice low, and replied, "That's strange. I haven't touched you in months." The silence that followed was cruel, heavy, unforgiving. In that moment, love turned into suspicion, and a marriage built on years of sacrifice cracked wide open. Something was deeply wrong, and he was the only one willing to see it. Who was the real father? How long had the lie been growing? And why did everyone else seem determined to protect the wrong person? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about injustice, hidden truths, and the quiet strength it takes to survive when your entire world turns against you. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. From the outside, their marriage looked like something people whispered about with envy. Daniel Cross and Lena Cross were the kind of couple others pointed to at dinner parties and said, "That's what real love looks like." They had been together for 12 years, married for 9. No public scandals, no raised voices in restaurants, no dramatic breakups and reconciliations for social media to consume. Just stability, consistency, respect. Daniel had always believed love was something you proved quietly. He woke before dawn every weekday, drove 40 minutes to a job he didn't hate but never loved, and came home every evening with groceries, small routines, and the unspoken promise that he would always be there. He remembered anniversaries without reminders. He fixed things before they broke. He listened more than he spoke. If loyalty were a currency, Daniel would have been rich. Lena, on the other hand, was effortless in ways Daniel never tried to be. She lit up rooms without meaning to. She remembered names, birthdays, tiny details about people's lives. Friends gravitated toward her warmth, her laughter, her ability to make anyone feel chosen. When people asked Daniel how he'd managed to marry someone like her, he used to smile and say he was the lucky one. And for a long time, he truly believed that. They had a child together once, a son who changed everything. Parenthood bonded them in exhaustion and pride, in midnight feedings, and whispered conversations over a crib. Daniel had never felt more anchored than when he held his child against his chest, Lena's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. That was the version of their marriage he held on to when things began to shift. The change didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as normal life. Longer work days, tired smiles. "Not tonight," said once, then twice, then often enough that Daniel stopped asking. Physical distance became routine. Emotional distance followed. Conversations shortened. Eye contact faded. Lena began scrolling through her phone during dinners, laughing at messages she never explained. When Daniel asked, she answered lightly, dismissively, "Just friends. Work stuff. You worry too much." And Daniel believed her, because believing was easier than imagining the alternative. He told himself marriages went through phases. That intimacy ebbed and flowed. That stress changed people. He blamed himself first, as he always did. Maybe he was boring. Maybe he wasn't attentive enough. Maybe love, like everything else, simply wore thin with time. So he tried harder. He booked weekend trips she postponed. He cooked meals she barely touched. He asked gentle questions and accepted vague answers. Every effort was met with polite distance, never anger, never honesty. What unsettled him most was how calm she remained. Lena wasn't cruel. She wasn't cold. She was absent, as if part of her life existed somewhere else, offstage, carefully hidden. And Daniel, standing in the same house, felt like a guest in his own marriage. Still, nothing prepared him for the moment she told him she was pregnant again. It wasn't the news itself that shattered him, it was the math. Daniel knew exactly how long it had been since they'd last been together. He remembered the date, not because it was special, but because it had been awkward, almost forced, an attempt to fix something already breaking. After that night, months of quiet had followed, months of excuses, months of distance. So when Lena said the words with that careful smile, something inside Daniel went still. His mind didn't race, his heart didn't pound. Instead, clarity settled in, sharp and undeniable. Reality lined up with memory, and the conclusion was unavoidable. He saw it then, the imbalance, the unfairness, the way the truth had been hidden in plain sight. While he'd been loyal, patient, shrinking himself to preserve peace, someone else had been stepping into the space he vacated. And worse, everyone else would likely expect him to accept it, to forgive without answers, to sacrifice again. In the seconds after his reply, as Lena's expression flickered between shock and fear, Daniel understood something profound. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about control, about lies protected by silence, about how easily a good man could be painted as heartless for refusing to swallow an injustice. He didn't yet know how deep the deception ran. He didn't know who else was involved, or how long the truth had been buried. But one thing was clear. The life he thought he had was already gone, and whatever came next would demand more strength than he had ever needed before. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the moment it truly began. The days after the announcement passed with an eerie normalcy that unsettled Daniel more than open conflict ever could. Lena moved through the house as if nothing irreversible had happened, humming softly while making coffee, folding laundry with deliberate care, answering calls in the next room with her voice lowered just enough to feel intentional. She never apologized, she never explained, and she never asked Daniel how he felt. He noticed how easily she avoided the subject, how skillfully she redirected conversations. When he mentioned timelines, she laughed it off. When he asked questions, she answered with questions of her own. "Why are you being so distant?" she asked one evening, her tone wounded, almost offended. "You should be happy, happy." The word echoed in his mind long after she left the room. Daniel began to replay the last year of their marriage, like a film slowed down, frame by frame. The late nights she blamed on work. The weekends she claimed she needed space to think. The sudden insistence on privacy. The phone always face down. The password changed without explanation. None of it had seemed alarming at the time. Now it felt deliberate, coordinated. What hurt most was not just the betrayal itself, but the quiet assumption that he would accept it, that he would bend, adjust, absorb the damage, and keep going. Lena spoke of the pregnancy as if it were a shared responsibility, a test of maturity, a moment that would reveal whether he was strong enough to move past the past. She talked about forgiveness without ever acknowledging wrongdoing, about family without mentioning truth. Daniel didn't argue. He listened, he watched, and slowly, something inside him shifted. He stopped trying to fix the marriage, stopped offering reassurance, stopped explaining his silence. Instead, he paid attention to details, to patterns, to what Lena said and what she didn't. He noticed the names that appeared on her phone more often. One in particular, Marcus Hale. Marcus wasn't a stranger. He was someone Daniel trusted, someone who had sat at their table, laughed at their jokes, held their child once with practiced ease. A colleague from Lena's extended professional circle, a man who had always been generous with compliments and favors, who seemed to appear whenever Daniel was absent. Looking back, Daniel realized how often Marcus had been there during the months Lena had pulled away, how natural his presence had seemed, how harmless. Now, nothing about it felt harmless. Daniel didn't confront him. Not yet. He needed certainty. Emotion had already cost him too much. If he was going to act, he would do so with clarity, not rage. So he began gathering information quietly, methodically. Bank statements, calendar entries, ride receipts, small inconsistencies that, alone, meant nothing, but together formed a pattern too precise to ignore. The more he learned, the more isolated he felt. Friends avoided taking sides. Family offered platitudes instead of support. Some hinted that he should step up. That pregnancy complicated things, that sometimes love meant swallowing pride. No one asked him how it felt to be lied to. No one asked whether the child was his. The assumption was clear. His role was to endure. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The house silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who believed loyalty was always rewarded. That patience guaranteed fairness. He wondered when exactly he had learned that wasn't true. The confirmation came sooner than he expected. A message popped up on Lena's tablet, left charging on the counter. Daniel hadn't meant to see it. He hadn't been looking. But the screen lit up, and there it was, an unfinished sentence. Intimate, familiar, unmistakable. Not just evidence of an affair, but of a relationship. Plans discussed, memories referenced, promises implied. The room seemed to close in around him. His hands trembled, not with anger, but with something colder, finality. In that moment, Daniel didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't wake Lena or demand explanations. He simply sat there, absorbing the truth as it settled into his bones. The betrayal was real, the injustice undeniable, and the silence surrounding it, his silence included, had only allowed it to grow. By morning, he had made a decision. He would no longer protect a lie that was destroying him. The confrontation came days later, calm and devastating. Daniel laid out what he knew, not accusing, just stating facts. Lena's composure cracked instantly. She denied at first, then deflected, then finally admitted parts of the truth. Never all at once, never fully. She spoke of loneliness, of mistakes, of confusion. She cried when it suited her, grew defensive when pressed, and through it all, she insisted the pregnancy shouldn't matter, that what mattered was moving forward. Daniel listened until she finished. Then he told her he would not raise a child born from deception. He would not be manipulated into silence, and he would not carry shame for someone else's choices. For the first time, Lena looked afraid. The fallout was swift and merciless. Whispers spread. Stories were rewritten. Daniel became the villain in narratives he didn't recognize, cold, unforgiving, heartless. Marcus disappeared from view, unreachable, protected by distance and denial. Lena leaned into sympathy, into the performance of vulnerability, into the comfort of being believed. But Daniel didn't chase the truth anymore. He prepared for it. He contacted a lawyer, requested a paternity test, documented everything. Each step was painful, but empowering. For the first time in months, he felt grounded, not because the situation was resolved, but because he was no longer pretending it wasn't happening. When the results finally came, they confirmed what Daniel already knew. The child was not his. The truth, once revealed, was unstoppable. Marcus was exposed. Lena's lies unraveled. Friends fell silent. Apologies came too late to matter. The same people who had urged Daniel to forgive now avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how wrong they'd been. And Daniel? He walked away, not unbroken, but unburdened. Healing didn't come quickly. It arrived in small, quiet moments, in therapy sessions where he learned to name his pain, in mornings where he woke without dread, in the slow rebuilding of self-respect that betrayal had nearly stolen. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't need to. Accountability had done its work. Months later, standing alone in a new apartment filled with light and possibility, Daniel understood something he never had before. Betrayal had taken many things from him, but it had also given him clarity, the courage to demand truth, the strength to walk away from injustice, and the certainty that his worth was never defined by someone else's lies. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was finally his. Life after the separation felt strangely quiet, as if the world had lowered its volume once the truth was spoken aloud. Daniel moved through his days with deliberate care, learning how to exist without the constant tension that had once lived in his chest. The new apartment was modest but clean, filled with light that poured through wide windows every morning. There were no echoes of arguments here, no memories clinging to the walls, just space. Space to breathe, space to think. Yet healing was not linear. Some nights, sleep refused to come. His mind replayed moments he wished he could rewrite, the dinners where he ignored his instincts, the nights he apologized for problems he hadn't caused, the way he'd slowly convinced himself that silence was love. Betrayal had a way of lingering, not as sharp pain, but as doubt. Doubt in his judgment, doubt in his worth. Therapy helped. It wasn't dramatic or transformative at first. It was uncomfortable, slow, and brutally honest. Daniel learned that loyalty without boundaries wasn't virtue, it was vulnerability. That love did not require self-erasure. That trusting someone didn't mean surrendering common sense. Each session peeled back another layer of guilt he had never earned. Outside those walls, consequences unfolded in ways Daniel never interfered with. Marcus's professional reputation collapsed quietly, but completely. Opportunities dried up, invitations stopped coming. People who once praised his charm now spoke his name in lowered voices. Lena tried to hold on to control, but the narrative she'd built couldn't survive daylight. Friends who once defended her withdrew. Sympathy thinned. Responsibility finally found its way back to her. She reached out more than once. Apologies arrived late at night, heavy with regret and self-pity. She spoke of fear, of pressure, of mistakes she wished she could undo. Daniel read the messages without responding. Forgiveness, he realized, did not require reconciliation. Closure didn't mean reopening doors. What surprised him most was how much lighter he felt without revenge. He had imagined satisfaction in seeing them fall, but instead found peace in indifference. Their choices were no longer his burden. He had reclaimed the one thing betrayal couldn't permanently steal: his agency. Time passed. Weeks folded into months. Daniel reconnected with parts of himself he'd neglected. He started running again, not to escape, but to feel strong. He traveled alone, discovering comfort in his own company. He laughed more easily. The man in the mirror looked steadier, older perhaps, but grounded in a way he'd never been before. One afternoon, sitting in a cafe he'd never visited before, Daniel struck up a conversation with a woman reading the same book he loved. There was no spark, no cinematic moment, just ease, honesty, no hidden agendas, and that was enough. For the first time, the idea of connection didn't feel dangerous. Daniel understood then that healing wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about rebuilding with intention, about choosing transparency over comfort, courage over familiarity. Betrayal had marked him, but it hadn't defined him. And as he walked home, under a sky wide with possibility, Daniel knew something with quiet certainty. The worst chapter of his life had taught him the most important lesson of all: truth, no matter how painful, was always the beginning of freedom. The legal process unfolded with the cold precision of machinery, indifferent to emotion, yet ruthless in consequence. Papers were filed, dates assigned, signatures demanded. Daniel approached it all with the same quiet discipline that had carried him through the worst nights of his life. He no longer reacted, he responded. Each document he reviewed felt less like a wound and more like proof that the truth had weight, structure, and permanence. Lena's demeanor changed as the reality settled in. The confidence she once wore so easily began to fray. During meetings, she oscillated between indignation and desperation, insisting she had been misunderstood, that circumstances had pushed her into impossible choices. She spoke as if regret alone could rearrange facts. When that failed, she leaned into tears, into stories of fear and vulnerability. But none of it altered the evidence. None of it changed the timeline. Daniel watched her from across polished tables, feeling a distant sadness for the woman he had once loved, and a deeper sadness for the version of himself who had trusted without question. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. Silence, once his weakness, had become his shield. The paternity confirmation was presented without ceremony. Numbers, signatures, clinical language that stripped the situation of all illusion. Lena's hands trembled as she read. Marcus wasn't present. He had chosen absence over accountability. A pattern Daniel now recognized clearly. That absence spoke louder than any confession ever could. News traveled quickly once the legal truth was established. Not in dramatic announcements, but in quiet confirmations, sideways glances, sudden shifts in tone. People who had once urged Daniel to do the right thing avoided him now, unsure how to reconcile their assumptions with reality. Apologies came awkwardly, if at all. Some relationships dissolved under the weight of unspoken guilt. Daniel let them go without resistance. What followed surprised everyone, including Daniel himself. He didn't pursue punitive damages. He didn't seek public vindication. He asked only for fairness, for separation, for the chance to move forward unburdened. His lawyer advised restraint, and Daniel agreed. He had no interest in prolonging a chapter that had already cost him enough. In the quiet weeks after the settlement, Daniel returned to the house one last time to collect the remaining pieces of his life. The air felt heavy with memories. Each room held echoes of laughter, arguments, compromises made in good faith. He moved slowly, deliberately, choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. Objects lost meaning when stripped of trust. In the end, he took very little. Lena watched from the doorway as he carried the final box out. Her expression was unreadable. Pride, regret, fear, all tangled together. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Daniel nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Some conversations didn't need words. Some endings didn't need closure. Driving away, Daniel felt a weight lift that he hadn't realized he was still carrying. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was honest. That mattered more than comfort ever had. Rebuilding a life required patience. Daniel learned to fill his days with intention rather than obligation. Mornings began with silence and coffee, evenings with books and long walks through neighborhoods he had never explored. He reconnected with old friends who listened without judgment, who asked questions without expectation. He learned to trust slowly, deliberately, without apology. There were setbacks, nights when anger resurfaced, sharp and uninvited, moments when a song or a scent dragged him back into memories he thought he had outgrown. But those moments passed. They always did. Healing, he discovered, it wasn't about erasing pain. It was about learning to live without letting it dictate every decision. One afternoon, Daniel received a message from Marcus. It was brief, carefully worded, filled with excuses disguised as explanations. Marcus spoke of confusion, of fear, of mistakes made under pressure. He asked for understanding. Daniel read it once, then deleted it. Some truths didn't require response. Some apologies arrived too late to matter. What mattered was the life Daniel was building now. A life grounded in clarity, in boundaries, in the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had chosen himself without becoming bitter. Months later, standing on a balcony, overlooking a city he had learned to love on his own terms, Daniel reflected on how close he had come to losing himself. Betrayal had tested him in ways he never anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths he hadn't known he possessed: the courage to walk away, the discipline to wait for truth, the grace to heal without hatred. He understood now that injustice thrived in silence, and that speaking up even softly could change everything. The man who once accepted less to keep the peace had been replaced by someone who valued honesty over harmony. And that shift, more than any legal victory, was his true triumph. The future no longer frightened him. It invited him, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel stepped forward without hesitation, ready to meet whatever came next, with eyes open and heart intact. The months that followed reshaped Daniel in ways no courtroom decision ever could. With the legal chapter closed, there were no more deadlines, No more documents demanding his attention. What remained was something far more difficult, learning who he was without the role he had played for so long: husband, protector, the one who endured. At first, the freedom felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Daniel caught himself waiting for conflict that never came. He would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, expecting an argument, a confrontation, some demand he had failed to anticipate. When silence greeted him instead, it felt both comforting and hollow. Peace, he realized, required adjustment. Work became an anchor, not as an escape, but as structure. Colleagues noticed the change in him, the steadier posture, the sharper focus, the absence of distraction. He spoke less about his personal life, not out of secrecy, but because it no longer needed explanation. His energy was no longer split between truth and pretense. Everything he did now came from a single, grounded place. There were moments, though, when grief resurfaced without warning. Not grief for Lena, but for the future he had once imagined. The shared milestones that would never happen. The version of himself that believed love alone could prevent betrayal. Those thoughts arrived quietly, often when he least expected them, while watching a father teach his child to ride a bike, or hearing laughter spill from a family across the street. Daniel learned not to fight those moments. He let them pass through him, acknowledging the loss without letting it define him. One evening, while sorting through old files, Daniel found a stack of handwritten notes he had once written to Lena. Apologies, promises, explanations he had never been asked to provide. He read them slowly, recognizing the pattern of self-blame threaded through every line. For the first time, he felt compassion for that man. He hadn't been weak. He had been loyal in a world that punished loyalty without boundaries. Daniel shredded the notes and threw them away. Social circles shifted in unexpected ways. Some friends faded, uncomfortable with the reminder of how wrong they had been. Others reappeared, quieter, humbler, offering support without justification. Daniel accepted what felt genuine and let the rest dissolve. Betrayal had refined his instincts. He trusted them now. Lena's presence became distant, almost abstract. Occasionally, he heard updates through mutual acquaintances, how she struggled to rebuild her image, how motherhood weighed heavier than she had anticipated, how Marcus remained absent, unwilling, or unable to shoulder responsibility. Daniel felt no satisfaction in those reports, only distance. Their lives no longer intersected in ways that mattered. What surprised him most was how differently he viewed anger. It still existed, but it no longer controlled him. Anger had once been a sharp edge he feared would consume him if unleashed. Now, it was simply information, a signal reminding him of his limits, his values. He listened to it, then let it go. Daniel began volunteering on weekends, offering his time to programs that supported men navigating separation and loss. He didn't share his story in full, only fragments when asked, enough to let others know they weren't alone, enough to show that survival didn't require bitterness. Watching others struggle reminded him how far he had come, and how easily he could have remained stuck if he had chosen silence over truth. One afternoon, during a quiet walk through a park, Daniel reflected on the moment that had changed everything. The sentence Lena had spoken so casually, the reply he had given without malice. At the time, he had believed that moment marked the end of his life as he knew it. Now he understood it differently. It had been an awakening. He had learned that injustice often hid behind smiles and expectations, that being the good one did not guarantee fairness, and that dignity sometimes required walking away from people who benefited from your silence. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the path, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. Not for the betrayal itself, but for what it had revealed, for the clarity it had forced upon him, for the strength it had uncovered. He no longer measured his worth by how much he could endure. He measured it by how honestly he could live, and in that truth, he found something deeper than closure. He found peace. As Daniel's life settled into a new rhythm, something unexpected began to surface beneath the calm. Clarity sharpened into purpose. He was no longer reacting to the aftermath of betrayal. He was actively shaping what came next. That distinction mattered. It meant he was no longer defined by what had been done to him, but by what he chose to do with the truth. He started noticing how often people around him normalized quiet suffering. In conversations at work, in casual exchanges at the gym, even in support groups, the same theme emerged again and again. Men swallowing pain to keep peace, excusing disrespect to avoid conflict, convincing themselves that endurance was the same as strength. Daniel recognized the pattern because he had lived it for years. One evening, after a long day, he sat alone on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. The memory returned uninvited. Lena's face, when he spoke that sentence, not anger, not guilt, shock, as if the script had been broken, as if he had said the one line he was never meant to say. Daniel understood now why that moment mattered so much. It wasn't the accusation, it was the refusal to pretend. That refusal had cost him everything he thought he had, and it had given him everything he needed. Marcus resurfaced again, this time not with excuses, but with desperation. A voicemail, shaky and strained, asking for a meeting, claiming he wanted to take responsibility. Daniel listened once, then archived it. Responsibility, he had learned, didn't arrive only after consequences, and meetings didn't undo choices already made. Instead, Daniel focused on building consistency into his life. He established routines that grounded him: early morning runs, cooking meals instead of eating out, journaling at night to untangle thoughts before sleep. These weren't dramatic acts of self-improvement. They were quiet affirmations that his life belonged to him again. He also began speaking more openly in therapy, allowing himself to articulate emotions he had once buried under logic. He spoke about humiliation, about how betrayal had made him question his own perception of reality, about how being disbelieved had hurt almost as much as the affair itself. Naming those experiences didn't weaken him, it strengthened him. Pain acknowledged lost its power to ambush. There were days when loneliness crept in, subtle and persistent. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of having been misunderstood, of having loved deeply and been treated as disposable. On those days, Daniel reminded himself that connection without honesty was not connection at all. He would rather be alone than surrounded by lies. Gradually, his confidence returned, not the loud, performative kind, but something steadier. He stopped explaining his past to people who hadn't earned the right to know it. He stopped apologizing for boundaries. When someone crossed a line, he addressed it calmly, immediately. No build-up. No resentment stored for later. Just clarity. One afternoon, Daniel was invited to speak at a small community workshop focused on rebuilding after separation. He hesitated at first. Public vulnerability wasn't his nature, but something in him recognized the invitation as an opportunity not to relive pain, but to contextualize it. He spoke without naming names, without dramatizing details. He spoke about silence, about how betrayal thrived when truth was postponed, about how dignity often required choosing discomfort over denial. Afterward, a man approached him, eyes red, voice tight. He said Daniel's words had given him permission to question a situation he'd been afraid to face. Daniel listened, nodded, and said nothing profound. He didn't need to. Sometimes presence was enough. That night, walking home, Daniel felt a sense of alignment he hadn't known before. His experience, once a source of shame, had become a point of connection, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was honest. Lena crossed his mind less frequently now. When she did, the image was distant, almost abstract. He no longer replayed conversations or imagined alternative outcomes. He accepted that some people revealed their true selves only when consequences removed their masks. That acceptance freed him from the need to understand motives that would never justify harm. What Daniel carried forward instead was discernment. He trusted slowly. He asked questions. He observed actions over time, and when something felt wrong, he didn't dismiss it for the sake of comfort. That alone changed everything. Months later, on a quiet morning filled with pale sunlight, Daniel stood in front of a mirror and barely recognized the man looking back, not because he looked different, but because his eyes held something new: certainty. He knew who he was. He knew what he would no longer tolerate, and he knew that his value did not depend on being chosen by someone who could not be honest. The story that began with a shocking sentence had evolved into something far larger. It was no longer about betrayal. It was about awakening, about the moment a man stopped doubting himself and started listening to the truth he had always known. Daniel stepped out into the day with steady breath and unburdened shoulders, aware that life would still bring challenges, still test him in ways he couldn't predict. But whatever came next, he would meet it without surrendering himself. And that, he knew now, was real strength. The deeper Daniel moved into this new chapter, the more he understood that healing was not a destination, but a discipline. There were no finish lines, no moment where the past simply stopped mattering. Instead, there were daily choices, small, quiet decisions that either pulled him back into old patterns or pushed him forward into something truer. One of the hardest lessons was learning to sit with uncertainty. For years, Daniel had believed that if he did everything right, loved fully, stayed loyal, avoided conflict, life would reward him with stability. Betrayal shattered that belief. Now, he had to accept that certainty was an illusion, and control even more so. What he did have was agency, and that was enough. At work, opportunities began to open up, not because he chased them, but because he showed up differently. Colleagues trusted his judgment. Managers noticed his clarity. When he spoke, people listened not because he was louder, but because he was precise. He no longer over-explained or softened his opinions to avoid discomfort. That confidence didn't come from arrogance. It came from knowing he could survive the consequences of honesty. Still, the past tested him when he least expected it. One evening, while leaving a grocery store, Daniel ran into someone he hadn't seen since before everything collapsed. An old mutual friend, someone who had once sat across from him at dinner, nodding sympathetically while silently choosing Lena's version of events. The greeting was awkward, filled with false cheer and hesitation. Then came the apology. "I didn't know what to believe back then," the friend said quietly. "I should have asked you." Daniel studied the man's face, searching for sincerity rather than words. He felt no anger, only clarity. "You believed what was easier," he replied calmly. "So did I." The conversation ended there. Daniel walked away without resentment, but also without reopening doors. Forgiveness, he had learned, did not require proximity. That night, he reflected on how deeply betrayal had altered his understanding of people. He no longer expected fairness from everyone. He no longer confused familiarity with loyalty. Instead, he paid attention to patterns who showed up consistently, who listened without agenda, who respected boundaries without being asked twice. Loneliness still visited him from time to time, usually in quiet moments when the city slowed and the noise faded. But it felt different now, less like abandonment, more like space. Space to choose connection intentionally. Rather than out of fear of being alone, Daniel began dating cautiously, not because he was afraid of being hurt again, but because he respected the process. He asked direct questions. He listened carefully to answers. When something felt misaligned, he didn't rationalize it away. He walked away without drama, without explanation owed. Each time he did, he felt stronger, not lonelier. In therapy, the conversations shifted. They no longer revolved around betrayal, but around identity. Who was Daniel when he wasn't proving his worth through sacrifice? What did he want now, beyond recovery? These questions were harder than the ones about pain. They required imagination, not just endurance. Daniel started writing again, something he had abandoned years earlier, not to tell his story publicly, but to process it privately. On blank pages, he explored anger he had never voiced, grief he had minimized, and hopes he had postponed indefinitely. Writing gave shape to emotions that once felt overwhelming. It reminded him that expression was not weakness, it was release. Occasionally, memories of Lena surfaced unexpectedly. Not the betrayal, but quieter moments, the way she laughed at certain jokes, the comfort of routine, the illusion of safety. Daniel allowed himself to feel those memories without guilt. Missing what was real didn't mean excusing what was false. Both could exist without contradiction. He heard through distant channels that Marcus had attempted to rebuild his life elsewhere, quietly, away from scrutiny. The news stirred nothing in Daniel. No anger, no curiosity, just detachment. Some people pass through your life to teach you what not to tolerate. Their relevance ended there. What mattered now was alignment between his values and his actions. Daniel no longer tolerated relationships that required him to shrink. He no longer mistook endurance for loyalty or silence for peace. He had learned, at great cost, that love without honesty was merely performance. One crisp morning, during a long run along the river, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but steadiness. The kind that didn't depend on circumstances or approval. The kind that came from knowing he would not abandon himself again. He slowed to a stop, catching his breath, watching the water move steadily forward. The river didn't resist obstacles. It adapted, redirected, persisted. Daniel smiled to himself. The metaphor felt almost obvious now. The injustice that once threatened to define him had become a reference point, not an identity. A reminder of what silence cost, of what truth restored. As he turned back toward home, Daniel understood something with quiet certainty. The story that began with betrayal was no longer about what had been taken from him. It was about what he had reclaimed, his voice, his boundaries, his sense of self. And whatever chapters still waited ahead, he would enter them awake, unafraid, and unwilling to trade his integrity for comfort ever again. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. Daniel stopped defining his life by what he had survived and began measuring it by what he was building. The past no longer sat in the driver's seat. It rode quietly in the back, a reminder rather than a command. With that shift came a different kind of courage, the courage to look forward without needing guarantees. He accepted a promotion that required relocation, something he would have refused before out of obligation, out of fear of disrupting a marriage that had already been hollow. The move wasn't dramatic, just a new city, a smaller circle, fewer expectations. Exactly what he needed. The anonymity felt freeing. No one knew his history unless he chose to share it. No one carried preconceived versions of him, shaped by rumors or loyalties. The new environment forced him to be present. New streets, new routines, new conversations that began without assumptions. Daniel discovered how much energy he had once spent managing perceptions, smoothing conflicts, anticipating needs that were never reciprocated. Without that burden, life felt lighter. He furnished his new place slowly, intentionally. Nothing was rushed. Each choice felt symbolic. Nothing entered his space without purpose. He learned to appreciate stillness, the kind that didn't demand explanation. Mornings became his favorite time of day. Coffee by the window, the city waking up, a sense of quiet ownership over his life. Yet healing, as always, wasn't linear. One afternoon, Daniel received a call from an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it. Something made him answer. It was Lena. Her voice sounded thinner than he remembered, stripped of its old confidence. She didn't accuse, she didn't cry. She spoke carefully, as if choosing each word could rewrite the past. She told him motherhood was harder than she expected, that support had vanished, that she finally understood the weight of her choices. Daniel listened without interrupting. She apologized not for the betrayal, but for how things ended, for the discomfort, for the consequences. It was an apology shaped more by loneliness than accountability. He recognized it immediately. "I'm not angry anymore. Daniel said quietly. But I'm not the person you're talking to. There was a long silence on the line. I hope you find what you're looking for, he added, not unkindly. Then he ended the call. Afterward, he felt no surge of emotion, no shaking hands, no racing thoughts, just confirmation. Confirmation that distance had become protection and clarity had replaced hope. That evening, Daniel went for a long walk, letting the city lights blur into a soft glow. He thought about how many versions of himself had existed over the years. The man who believed love meant endurance, the man who confused patience with virtue, the man who feared truth because it threatened stability. He honored them all. They had done the best they could with what they knew at the time. But he was no longer that man. In the weeks that followed, Daniel grew closer to a small group of people who valued honesty above harmony. Conversations were direct. Disagreements didn't feel dangerous. Respect didn't have to be negotiated. For the first time, relationships felt mutual rather than managed. One of those connections deepened naturally. Without force, there was no dramatic declaration, no rush, just consistency, transparency, a shared understanding that trust was built slowly through alignment rather than promises. Daniel paid attention to how he felt, not anxious, not vigilant, not afraid to ask questions, calm, grounded. That calm became his compass. He noticed how easily people revealed themselves when you stopped projecting what you wanted to see. He noticed how intuition sharpened when fear quieted, and he noticed how peace followed boundaries, not compromise. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel still reflected on the injustice that had started it all. How easily he had been expected to accept betrayal for the sake of appearances. How quickly truth had been dismissed when it disrupted comfort. Those thoughts no longer filled him with anger. They filled him with resolve. He would never again shrink himself to preserve someone else's lies. Months later, during a quiet weekend, Daniel visited a small coastal town on impulse. Standing by the water, he watched waves roll in relentlessly, unbothered by resistance. The ocean didn't argue with obstacles. It reshaped them. The thought stayed with him. Betrayal had once felt like an ending. Now he understood it had been an interruption, violent, unjust, but ultimately clarifying. It had stripped away illusions he didn't know he was carrying. It had forced him to choose himself when no one else would. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel felt gratitude not for the pain, but for the awakening it triggered, for the strength that followed honesty, for the life that emerged when he stopped tolerating silence. The story that began with shock and injustice was no longer defined by those moments. It had evolved into something quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. It had become a story about self-respect. And this time, Daniel knew exactly how it would continue on his terms, with eyes open and with no apology for demanding the truth. The more Daniel settled into his new life, the more he realized how deeply betrayal had once shaped his instincts. Even in calm moments, there were echoes, brief flickers of caution, subtle pauses before trust. He didn't fight them. He studied them. They were reminders, not wounds. Signals that his mind had learned, adapted, survived. What surprised him was how differently truth felt now. Once, truth had been a threat, something that could dismantle everything he'd built. Now, it felt like shelter. When conversations turned uncomfortable, he didn't rush to smooth them over. When questions arose, he asked them plainly. The fear that honesty would cost him everything had been replaced by the understanding that dishonesty always would. At work, Daniel's reputation grew quietly. He was known as someone who didn't play games, who didn't shift blame, who spoke directly, even when the answer wasn't convenient. People sought his input not because he dominated rooms, but because he brought clarity into them. Leadership, he learned, wasn't about control, it was about consistency. Still, there were moments when the past returned unexpectedly. One afternoon, while waiting for a meeting to start, Daniel overheard two colleagues discussing a mutual acquaintance whispers about an affair, speculation about paternity, jokes disguised as concern. The conversation wasn't about him, but the words hit close enough to stir something deep in his chest. For a brief moment, anger surged not at them, but at how easily people reduced complex pain into gossip. Daniel stood, interrupted politely, and said one sentence that surprised even himself. "You never know what someone paid to survive a story like that." Then he walked away. Later, alone in his office, he reflected on how that moment would have paralyzed him once. He would have swallowed the discomfort, replayed it endlessly. I wondered if he should have said something different. Now, it passed through him like weather. Felt, acknowledged, gone. That evening, Daniel met someone for dinner, a person he had been seeing slowly, intentionally. There was no drama between them, no emotional roller coaster, just honesty that didn't require constant reassurance. During the meal, they spoke about boundaries, about expectations, about past mistakes without assigning blame. It wasn't romanticized vulnerability, it was grounded transparency. Daniel noticed how safe that felt. Not safe because nothing could go wrong, but safe because if something did, it could be addressed without deception. Later that night, as he walked home under quiet streetlights, Daniel thought about the man he had been during the early days of the betrayal, how desperately he had searched for explanations, for fairness, for someone to validate his reality. How much energy he had spent questioning himself instead of the lies placed before him. He understood now that injustice often succeeded because it relied on a person's decency, on their reluctance to accuse, on their fear of appearing unreasonable. The system favored those who spoke first, cried loudest, or controlled the narrative. Daniel had lost that battle once, not because he was wrong, but because he had been silent. That lesson stayed with him. Months later, a mutual acquaintance from his past reached out unexpectedly, someone who had once sided firmly against him. Echoing Lena's claims without hesitation, the message was brief, awkward, filled with regret, an apology, finally, one that acknowledged believing lies because they were easier than confronting discomfort. Daniel read it slowly. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. He replied with a single line, "I hope you're more careful with the truth next time." Nothing more, nothing less. Forgiveness, he had learned, wasn't about reopening wounds. It was about refusing to carry them forward. As seasons changed, Daniel found himself thinking less about what had happened and more about what it had taught him. He learned that betrayal didn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it arrived smiling, patient, confident that silence would protect it. He learned that being reasonable in the face of deception often benefited only the deceiver. And he learned that self-respect wasn't loud, it was firm. There were still hard days, days when fatigue crept in, when trust felt heavy, when the idea of fully opening himself again seemed exhausting. On those days, Daniel reminded himself that strength wasn't measured by how quickly you moved on, but by how honestly you moved forward. He returned often to one thought. If he had ignored that moment, if he had swallowed his doubt and played along, his life would look very different now. Comfortable, perhaps, stable on the surface, but hollow, built on denial. Instead, he had chosen the harder path, the one that demanded courage, patience, and solitude. And in return, it had given him something rare, alignment between who he was and how he lived. One quiet Sunday morning, Daniel sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching sunlight stretch across the floor. There was no urgency in the day ahead, no performance to maintain, no truth to suppress, just peace. The injustice that once threatened to break him had become a foundation solid, instructive, immovable. It reminded him that silence was never neutral, that truth required action, and that dignity was something you defended, even when no one else would. Daniel finished his coffee and stood, ready to step into whatever came next. He didn't need guarantees. He didn't need validation. He had himself, and that, finally, was enough. The 10th month, after everything unraveled, marked a quiet turning point. Daniel hadn't anticipated. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did, and for the first time, that felt right. There were no crises demanding his attention, no emotional ambushes waiting behind ordinary days. Life had settled into something steady, and Daniel was finally strong enough to trust that steadiness. He had learned how to live without bracing himself. There were still reminders of the past, but they arrived softened by distance. A song drifting from a passing car, a couple arguing quietly in a cafe, a pregnant woman standing alone at a crosswalk. Each image carried a ghost of memory, but none of them pulled him backward anymore. They passed through him like shadows at dusk present, but powerless, Daniel's work began to reflect that inner stability. He was asked to lead a new project, one that required difficult conversations, ethical decisions, and long-term accountability. In another life, he might have hesitated, worried about being liked, about maintaining harmony. Now, he accepted without fear. He knew who he was when things became uncomfortable. He trusted that version of himself. During meetings, he noticed how people responded differently to him, not with admiration or intimidation, but with trust. When Daniel spoke, he didn't posture, he didn't overpromise. He told the truth as he saw it, clearly and calmly. And when he didn't know something, he said so. That honesty created a strange ripple effect. Others began doing the same. He realized then that leadership wasn't about authority, it was about alignment. Outside of work, his personal life remained intentionally simple. The person he was seeing remained part of his world, but never its center. They moved slowly, deliberately, without labels that felt like armor. They spoke openly about fears, expectations, boundaries. There were no games, no tests disguised as affection. When disagreements arose, they were addressed, not stored. Daniel noticed something important. He never felt the need to explain himself twice. One evening, after a long walk along the river, Daniel received a message from someone he hadn't thought about in months, Lena's sister. The message was polite, restrained, almost formal. She wrote to say she was sorry for how things had unfolded, that she had believed Lena without question, that she now understood the damage that silence and loyalty to the wrong person could cause. Daniel sat with the message for a long time. There was a version of him who would have clung to that apology, dissected it. I wondered why it had taken so long. That version was gone. What remained was clarity. He replied kindly, briefly, without reopening old doors. He didn't need acknowledgement to validate his experience anymore. He already knew the truth. What surprised him most, as time passed, was how little space anger occupied in his life now. Not because the betrayal had been small, but because he had refused to let it become permanent. Anger had served its purpose. It had alerted him to injustice. It had given him the strength to act, and then it had stepped aside. Daniel had learned that holding on to anger after its work was done was like gripping a blade long after the danger had passed. He chose not to bleed for something that no longer existed. On a quiet Saturday morning, Daniel returned to a neighborhood he hadn't visited since before the separation. The streets looked the same, the houses unchanged, but everything felt distant, like a photograph from another lifetime. He walked slowly, observing without nostalgia. The memories no longer asked for attention. Standing at the edge of a small park, Daniel reflected on how much had shifted not externally, but internally. Once, he had feared confrontation more than betrayal, feared disruption more than dishonesty. Now, he understood that peace built on denial was fragile, and that discomfort faced early saved immeasurable pain later. That realization had changed how he approached everything. He no longer postponed difficult conversations. He no longer rationalized behavior that felt wrong. He no longer accepted half-truths to preserve comfort. These weren't rigid rules, they were acts of self-respect. Later that evening, Daniel sat on his balcony, the city glowing softly below. He thought about how close he had come to staying silent, to accepting a reality that would have slowly eroded him from the inside. He thought about how easy it would have been to choose convenience over truth, appearance over dignity, and he felt something close to awe at how one sentence spoken calmly, without cruelty, had redirected his entire life. "I haven't touched you in months." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a refusal to lie. That refusal had cost him everything he once thought mattered, and it had given him everything that actually did. As night settled in, Daniel felt a quiet certainty anchor itself in his chest. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, he would meet them awake. He would not betray himself again, not for love, not for peace, not for anyone else's comfort. The injustice that once tried to break him had failed, not because it wasn't powerful, but because he had chosen truth. And that choice, he knew now, would carry him forward into every chapter yet to be written. Time moved forward with a steady, almost deliberate rhythm, as if life itself were rewarding Daniel for finally choosing to walk in step with the truth. By the 11th month, the chaos that once defined his days felt distant, not erased, but neatly filed away, accessible if needed, no longer spilling into everything else. Yet just when Daniel believed the past had finished teaching him, it returned one last time, not with drama, but with consequence. It came in the form of a legal notice, forwarded by his attorney. Marcus had filed a claim, an attempt to shift responsibility, to dispute certain financial obligations connected to the child. It was a desperate move, thinly veiled as procedure. Daniel read the documents slowly, feeling an old tension flicker briefly in his chest before dissolving into something else. Resolve. This wasn't about reopening wounds. It was about closure. The hearing was scheduled quietly, without spectacle. Daniel attended not with anxiety, but with preparedness. He sat calmly as arguments were presented, watching how truth behaved under pressure. Marcus appeared thinner, more rigid, his confidence replaced by defensive precision. Lena was present too, her posture closed, eyes rarely lifting. The dynamic between them was strained, transactional, two people bound not by affection, but by consequence. Daniel spoke only when asked. He didn't dramatize. He didn't attack. He answered questions plainly, allowing facts to do what emotions once had not. The timeline, the evidence, the decisions he had made once the truth was undeniable. His composure contrasted sharply with the instability unfolding across the room. When the ruling came, it was swift. The claim was denied, responsibility reaffirmed. No ambiguity left to exploit. As the room emptied, Daniel felt no surge of triumph, only finality. Outside the courthouse, Lena approached him hesitantly. For a moment, Daniel considered walking past her, but something in her expression, resignation, stripped of performance, made him pause. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze, calm and steady. "It ended the moment honesty stopped." She nodded, as if absorbing that truth for the first time. There were no apologies this time, no attempts to shift blame, just silence. And somehow, that silence felt more honest than anything she had offered before. Daniel walked away without looking back. In the weeks that followed, he noticed how differently he carried himself. Not lighter, exactly, but grounded. Like someone who had weathered a storm and learned how to read the sky. The legal closure had sealed something inside him. Not the past itself, but his relationship to it. He no longer wondered what he could have done differently. He no longer replayed conversations, searching for missed signs. He had accepted that betrayal wasn't a failure of perception. It was a failure of integrity on the part of those who lied. That distinction mattered. Daniel began mentoring younger colleagues at work, not formally, but through presence. He encouraged direct communication, modeled accountability. When conflicts arose, he addressed them early, without defensiveness. His leadership style wasn't loud, but it was effective. People trusted him because he never asked them to pretend. One afternoon, a junior colleague confided in him about a situation that felt wrong, contradictions, half-truths, a sense of being manipulated. Daniel didn't give advice. He asked questions, helped the man articulate what he already knew but was afraid to admit. Pay attention to how often you're asked to doubt yourself, Daniel said simply. That's usually where the truth is hiding. The words lingered with him afterward. They applied not just to work, but to life. Outside of professional growth, Daniel continued nurturing his personal world carefully. The relationship he had been exploring deepened, not through intensity, but through consistency. There were disagreements, but no gaslighting, concerns, but no dismissal. When something felt off, it was named, not buried. For the first time, Daniel experienced intimacy that didn't require vigilance, and that, more than anything, confirmed how far he had come. One evening, during a quiet dinner, his partner asked him a question he hadn't anticipated. "Do you ever regret how it all ended?" Daniel considered it carefully. "I regret the time I spent trying to protect a lie that wasn't mine," he said. "But I don't regret choosing the truth." That answer surprised even him. As winter approached, Daniel found himself reflecting less on betrayal and more on identity. Who he had become through adversity. How injustice had stripped him down and forced him to rebuild intentionally. He no longer defined himself as someone who had been wronged. He defined himself as someone who had responded with restraint instead of retaliation, with clarity instead of chaos, with dignity instead of denial. On a cold morning filled with pale light, Daniel stood by his window, watching frost dissolve as the sun rose higher. He thought about how easily life could have gone another way, how silence could have kept him trapped in a narrative that slowly erased him. Instead, one moment of honesty had changed everything. The betrayal that once felt like an ending had become a threshold, a brutal one, yes, but also necessary. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about others, but about himself, about his tolerance for injustice, about his fear of disruption, about the cost of being the reasonable one in unreasonable circumstances. Now, standing firmly on the other side, Daniel understood something he wished he'd known earlier. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. And with that understanding, he stepped forward into the next chapter of his life, not naive, not guarded, but awake. The 12th chapter of Daniel's life unfolded without ceremony, yet it carried a weight that felt heavier than all the dramatic moments before it. There were no courtrooms now, no confrontations waiting to erupt. What remained was something far more revealing, the aftermath of truth, and how people behaved when there was nowhere left to hide. The consequences reached Marcus first. Word spread quietly through professional circles, missed obligations, withdrawn partnerships, unanswered calls, no scandal headlines, no public spectacle, just doors closing one by one. Daniel heard about it through others, never sought the information himself. He felt no satisfaction, only a distant recognition of cause and effect. Accountability, he learned, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it crept in through silence. Lena's unraveling was more visible. She struggled beneath the weight of responsibilities she had once assumed would be shared or somehow absorbed by others. The confidence she once used as armor no longer held. Mutual acquaintances spoke carefully around Daniel. Unsure how much he wanted to know, he wanted very little. He had released the need to track outcomes that no longer involved him. What lingered instead was a strange clarity about human nature. Daniel began to see how often people avoided truth, not because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. He recognized the subtle bargains people made with themselves, how they justified small lies to protect comfort, how quickly they shifted blame when those lies collapsed. Betrayal, he realized, was rarely spontaneous. It was practiced, rehearsed, sustained by silence. This awareness didn't harden him, it refined him. At work, Daniel was invited to sit in on an ethics review panel, a role he accepted without hesitation. The discussions were nuanced, often uncomfortable. People defended questionable decisions with polished language and selective memory. Daniel listened closely, then asked simple questions that cut through complexity. What did you know? When did you know it? And why didn't you speak up? Those questions changed rooms. Colleagues began seeking his perspective privately, not for validation, but for grounding. They trusted his judgment because he never weaponized it. He didn't shame. He didn't excuse. He clarified. And clarity, Daniel discovered, was disarming. In quieter moments, Daniel reflected on how close he had come to losing that clarity himself. There were nights early on when doubt had nearly consumed him, when he wondered if staying silent would have been easier, if accepting the lie would have spared him pain. Those thoughts no longer frightened him. He understood now that ease and peace were not the same thing. One evening, while sorting through old belongings he had stored away months earlier, Daniel found a small framed photo he had forgotten about. It showed him and Lena years ago, laughing at something unseen, faces unguarded. He studied it for a long time, not with longing, but with curiosity. He saw now what he hadn't then, the imbalance. The way he leaned in while she looked outward. Daniel didn't tear the photo apart. He didn't keep it either. He placed it back into the box and closed the lid gently. Some memories didn't need to be destroyed to lose their power. They only needed to be contextualized. The relationship he had been building continued to grow, not dramatically, but steadily. There were no promises of forever, no declarations designed to reassure insecurity, just presence, mutual effort, a shared understanding that trust was not assumed, it was earned daily through alignment. Daniel paid attention to how disagreements were handled, how apologies were given, how accountability was shared. These details mattered now. One night, sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant, his partner asked, "What scares you now?" The question caught him off guard. Daniel thought carefully. "Losing myself again," he said finally. "Not to someone else's betrayal, but to my own silence." The answer felt right, honest, complete. Later, walking home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, Daniel realized how far he had traveled emotionally. Once, fear had been about abandonment, about conflict, about being misunderstood. Now, fear was simply a guidepost pointing toward values he refused to compromise. He no longer feared being alone, he feared being untrue. In the months that followed, Daniel noticed a shift in how people responded to him socially. Conversations were more direct, expectations clearer. Some people found his presence uncomfortable, not because he was confrontational, but because he no longer participated in pretense. Others found it refreshing. Those were the people he kept close. An invitation arrived unexpectedly from a mutual acquaintance hosting a gathering Daniel had once been excluded from during the height of the scandal. The message was polite, cautious, perhaps even hopeful. Daniel considered it, then declined. Not out of resentment, but out of discernment. He no longer placed himself in spaces that had once required him to defend his reality. That decision felt like progress. One afternoon, while walking through a crowded street, Daniel overheard a couple arguing quietly. The words were sharp, familiar denials, deflections, emotional leverage. He felt a brief tightening in his chest, then something else. Compassion, not for the behavior, but for the cycle. He hoped, silently, that one of them would speak a truth strong enough to interrupt it. He had learned that interruption was everything. As the year edged closer to its end, Daniel found himself thinking less about what had happened and more about what it had prevented. A life of quiet erosion, of endless compromise disguised as maturity, of becoming someone who survived by shrinking. The betrayal had been unjust, painful, unnecessary. But it had also been clarifying. Standing at his window one evening, watching rain streak the glass, Daniel understood something with deep certainty. Truth did not guarantee happiness, but it guaranteed integrity. And integrity, once reclaimed, changed the shape of everything. He had not been spared hardship. He had been spared self-deception, and that realization earned, not given, felt like the most honest victory of all. The 13th stretch of Daniel's journey arrived, not as a dramatic reckoning, but as a quiet redistribution of power. The truth had already spoken. Now it settled into lives, reshaping them in ways no apology could undo. Marcus's collapse became undeniable. The professional exile he'd tried to outrun followed him from place to place. References went unanswered, partnerships dissolved without explanation. People who once praised his reliability now spoke in cautious generalities. Unwilling to vouch for a man whose judgment had proved so self-serving, there was no single moment of public disgrace, only the slow erosion of credibility, the kind that leaves a person alone with their choices. Daniel observed it from a distance, neither invested nor indifferent. It wasn't justice as spectacle. It was consequence as gravity. Lena's reckoning unfolded differently. Without the protective shield of narrative control, she faced the daily grind of responsibility without applause or sympathy. The attention that once buoyed her thinned, friends grew careful, then scarce. Support came with conditions, now honesty required, timelines questioned, patience limited. She learned, painfully, that remorse could not substitute for trust. Daniel heard about this secondhand and felt something he hadn't expected. Relief, not because she suffered, but because the truth no longer needed him to carry it. For Daniel, accountability took a different shape. It meant choosing what to invest in and what to release. He finalized lingering financial matters with precision, refusing shortcuts that would blur boundaries. He kept records, met deadlines, and declined compromises that smelled of convenience over clarity. This wasn't rigidity. It was stewardship of his time, his energy, his integrity. Work reflected that steadiness. The project he led reached a critical phase, one that required decisive calls and the courage to disappoint. When a proposal arrived, padded with optimism but thin on ethics, Daniel rejected it calmly. He explained why. He invited revision grounded in reality. The room shifted, resistance softened, people adapted. He watched how often progress followed honesty, once the fear of displeasing someone lost its grip. Outside the office, his personal life deepened without theatrics. The relationship he'd nurtured continued to reveal itself through actions rather than promises. When schedules clashed, they spoke plainly. When misunderstandings surfaced, they addressed them early. Without posturing, Daniel noticed the absence of dread, no rehearsed explanations, no defensive vigilance. He felt present in conversations instead of scanning for danger. That presence, he realized, was intimacy's truest measure. Yet there were days when echoes returned. A sudden memory during a commute. A phrase overheard that tugged at old doubts. Daniel welcomed those moments with curiosity rather than resistance. He asked what they were trying to teach him now. Usually, the answer was simple. Maintain boundaries. Speak sooner. Trust actions. One evening, an email arrived from someone Daniel hadn't expected, an old friend who had cut contact during the fallout. The message was candid, uncomfortable, and sincere. The friend admitted choosing the path of least resistance, believing the loudest story rather than the truest one. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He acknowledged harm and left the door open without expectation. Daniel read it twice. He felt no rush to respond. After a day, he replied briefly, thanking him for the honesty and wishing him well. He didn't reopen the friendship, not out of punishment, but alignment. The relationship had ended the moment trust became negotiable. Daniel honored that truth without bitterness. As winter softened into early spring, Daniel found himself mentoring more intentionally, not as an expert dispensing wisdom, but as someone modeling a way of being. He taught by example how to ask hard questions without accusation, how to name concerns without theatrics, how to exit situations that demanded self-erasure. He noticed how people leaned in when they felt permission to be honest. He noticed how courage became contagious when fear was named. On a quiet Saturday, Daniel volunteered at a community forum addressing workplace integrity. The stories shared were varied, but the pattern was familiar. People doubting themselves because speaking up threatened stability. Daniel didn't recount his own experience in detail. He spoke about interruption, about the moment when silence stops serving and starts enabling harm, about choosing discomfort early to avoid devastation later. Afterward, a woman approached him, eyes bright with resolve. "I thought being reasonable meant staying quiet," she said. "I see now it can mean asking the hardest question." Daniel nodded. He understood the relief that followed that realization. At home, he continued shaping a life that reflected his values. He cooked more, hosted small gatherings, chose simplicity over distraction. He curated his environment the way he curated relationships intentionally. Items with no purpose were given away. Commitments without meaning were declined. The clarity he'd fought for became a daily practice. He thought less about the past now, not because it had faded, but because it had been integrated. It no longer demanded attention. It informed decisions quietly, like a compass kept in a pocket. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Daniel considered the idea of forgiveness, not as absolution, but as release. He realized he had already forgiven in the only way that mattered, by refusing to let others' choices dictate his future. He had forgiven by building a life that didn't orbit their mistakes. When the final administrative matters, closed signatures completed, accounts settled, Daniel felt a subtle shift. Not celebration, completion, the kind that arrives when nothing remains unresolved within you. He went for a long walk, breathing in cool air, noticing how easily his steps fell into rhythm. His body knew before his mind did, this chapter was done. Looking ahead, Daniel didn't imagine perfection. He imagined honesty. He imagined disagreements handled with respect, trust built through consistency, and boundaries treated as care rather than threat. He imagined a life where truth was the starting point, not the casualty. The injustice that had once demanded his attention now served as a teacher at a respectful distance. It reminded him what silence cost and what clarity protected. It reminded him that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed, often quietly, often alone. As he turned back toward home, lights glowing warmly in the distance, Daniel felt a steady gratitude, not for the pain, but for the person it had shaped. He had paid attention. He had acted. He had chosen himself without becoming cruel. That choice had changed everything. And with consequences settled and accountability complete, Daniel stepped forward not vindicated, not hardened, but whole, ready to invest in a future built on truth, one deliberate decision at a time. The 14th chapter of Daniel's life unfolded with a gentler cadence, like a long exhale after years of holding his breath. The urgency that once drove him proving facts, defending truth, correcting narratives, had finally faded. What remained was a quieter, more deliberate intention to live in a way that honored everything he had learned without being trapped by it. Healing, Daniel discovered, was not about forgetting. It was about integration. He noticed how his mornings began differently now. There was no knot in his stomach when he checked his phone, no subconscious preparation for conflict. He woke with a sense of neutrality that felt almost luxurious. Some days were joyful, others mundane, a few heavy, but none felt threatening. That, in itself, was progress. He continued therapy. Though the conversations had shifted, they spoke less about betrayal and more about identity, about how Daniel could remain open without becoming unguarded, how he could trust without surrendering discernment, how strength could coexist with softness. These were not questions with final answers, but practices he returned to again and again. One afternoon, during a session, his therapist asked him a simple question. "What do you need now that you didn't allow yourself to need before?" Daniel paused. "Permission," he said finally, "to choose myself without explaining." The words lingered in the room. They felt true. That permission reshaped small moments. He declined invitations that felt obligatory. He said yes to experiences that felt nourishing, even when they didn't make sense on paper. He allowed rest without guilt. He allowed joy without suspicion. He allowed sadness to arrive and leave, without turning it into a story about failure. The relationship in his life reflected that same balance. There was affection, yes, but also autonomy. They spent time together without merging identities. They supported each other without rescuing. When one needed space, it was given, without interrogation. Daniel felt seen, not because someone mirrored him, but because they respected his boundaries. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, a small disagreement surfaced. Nothing dramatic, just a misalignment of expectations. Daniel noticed his old instinct flicker, the urge to smooth things over quickly, to concede before tension grew. He paused, spoke calmly, named what he needed. The conversation resolved itself without escalation. Afterward, he felt a quiet pride, not because he'd won, but because he hadn't abandoned himself. Outside of relationships, Daniel invested in things that anchored him: physical movement, long walks, writing without audience. He volunteered less frequently now, choosing depth over breadth. He understood that service did not require self-sacrifice. It required presence. Occasionally, someone would ask about his past, sensing layers beneath his calm. Daniel answered honestly but briefly. He no longer needed to recount details to justify who he was. The story existed, but it did not define every interaction. He was more interested in who people were becoming than in who they had been. There were moments of reflection that arrived unexpectedly. Standing in line at a store, sitting in traffic, watching rain gather on glass. In those moments, Daniel sometimes thought about the version of himself who had once doubted his own reality. The man who questioned his instincts because doing so felt more polite than asserting them. He felt compassion for that man now. He didn't know yet, Daniel thought, but he was listening. That thought brought a sense of continuity rather than rupture. The past wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher that spoke harshly because the lesson mattered. As spring gave way to early summer, Daniel planned a short trip alone. Not as an escape, but as a ritual. He chose a place with water and quiet, where days stretched long and evenings softened slowly. There, away from routine, he allowed himself to reflect without agenda. Sitting by the shore one morning, watching light ripple across the surface, Daniel considered how differently he now understood love. It was no longer endurance, no longer sacrifice without reciprocity. Love, he realized, was alignment sustained over time. It was honesty practiced daily. It was the absence of fear when truth needed to be spoken. He also understood forgiveness differently, not as reconciliation, not as forgetting, but as releasing the expectation that the past could have been anything other than what it was. Forgiveness, for Daniel, meant accepting reality fully, without denial, without longing for alternate endings. That acceptance felt like freedom. On his final evening there, Daniel wrote a letter he never intended to send. He addressed it not to Lena or Marcus, but to himself. He thanked himself for speaking up, for enduring uncertainty, for choosing discomfort over dishonesty. He acknowledged the cost. He honored the courage it had taken to walk away, when staying would have been easier. He folded the letter and tucked it into his journal. When he returned home, life resumed without disruption. That continuity felt earned. He had built a life sturdy enough to absorb memories without collapsing under them. He had built relationships that didn't require him to perform. He had built trust with himself, the most fragile and essential form of trust. The injustice that once shattered his world had not disappeared. It had transformed. It had become a reference point, a line he would never cross again, a reminder that silence could be dangerous and truth, even when lonely, was protective. Daniel knew there would be future challenges, moments when honesty cost him something, relationships that ended because alignment was lost, discomfort that arrived uninvited. But he no longer feared those possibilities. He trusted his capacity to respond. Standing in his kitchen one morning, sunlight filling the room, Daniel felt something settle quietly within him. Not triumph, not closure, something steadier, peace. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the durable peace of self-respect. And as he stepped into the day, grounded and unburdened, Daniel knew he was ready for whatever final chapter remained, not because it would be perfect, but because it would be true. Sometimes the most painful moments in life are not meant to destroy us, but to wake us up. Betrayal hurts not just because trust is broken, but because it forces us to confront the places where we stayed silent to keep the peace. This story reminds us that truth is not cruel. Denial is. When you choose honesty, you may lose people, comfort, and familiar versions of your life. But what you gain is far more valuable: self-respect, clarity, and the freedom to live without betraying yourself. Healing does not mean forgetting what happened. It means refusing to let it define your future. Strength is not found in how much you endure, but in the moment you decide you deserve better. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what part touched you most. And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one.